Hey everyone, and welcome back to Time with Tim. I'm Andy Carlson, joined by Tim Fletcher, and today we're honored to sit down with Dr. Luke Beardon. Dr. Beardon is a senior lecturer in autism at Sheffield Hallam University, a multi-award-winning educator and one of the most respected voices in the field of autism today. For over 30 years, he's been advocating for autistic individuals, not by trying to make them fit a neurotypical world, but by helping the world understand and adapt to them. Luke, we're so grateful to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
And we really love our guests to get to know a little bit of the human behind who we're talking to. And so we'd just love if you could share some of your background and maybe begin with some of your childhood experiences so listeners can get a fuller sense of who you are and what's shaped your perspective.
Where to start? I hate talking about myself. Although I absolutely love talking about autism, so maybe I could combine the two. I first knowingly came across autism at the age of 14. And at school, there was a choice of doing various different tasks, like on a voluntary basis. And I chose to do my voluntary service at a special school, which was part of a hospital, with very young children who weren't fitting into mainstream schools. So we used to go on a Tuesday afternoon and just play with little autistic kids all afternoon, and absolutely loved it. They made so much more sense to me than the real world, or the outside world, I should say. So that's when I first kind of got into the whole world of autism. Ended up becoming a nursing assistant and working with people. I've always enjoyed working with people. Did a university degree because I didn't really know what else to do. Became postman, which is a terrible idea if you're really, really bad at directions. So I spent 2 weeks getting completely lost and then decided that probably wasn't the best idea for me. And ended up working as a grade 1 support worker in a residential home for adults with who were autistic and had additional learning disabilities. And that's probably how old am I? Well, that's well over 30 years ago now. I still see myself as a grade 1 support worker, but I just happen to have a slightly more academic title now. I ended up working hands-on for several years, working with adults and young autistic people. I joined the National Autistic Society, which is the UK's kind of leading charity, and they run schools and adult services. Had various different jobs there, and then I got asked to apply for this job at the university. There's no way I would have applied voluntarily. As I'm someone who just tends to do as he's told, I got told to apply, so I did. And for some bizarre reason, they decided to employ me as a senior lecturer. So here I still am.
So 22 years ago, I got asked to kind of enter the world of complex trauma and addiction, and wasn't something I was even on my radar at that point. But I went in, and complex trauma wasn't even a term yet. It wasn't even really understood, but I was dealing with complex trauma people every day, all day long, and I loved it. And like you, it was like, there's something here that shaped their soul in a way that they think at a deeper level, a more real, honest level. And so my point is that much of my learning at that point, there wasn't textbooks, there wasn't courses, it was just hands-on working with people every day. And you begin piecing together, oh, this is an issue with these, this is an issue, this is an issue, this is a strength, this is where they struggle, they don't have tools in this area. And just you slowly piece together this 1,000-piece puzzle of what makes these people tick and what's happened to kind of create some of their stuff. Can you walk us through a little bit of your journey, starting at 14 and working with these children, and then you're gradually got to be piecing things together in your mind?
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, almost like diving into the main topic of conversation, really, in terms of why so many autistic and other neurodivergent individuals might be living with trauma. And I've come up with, don't bother Googling this because I invented the term, but I came up with this concept of autistic epistemology, which is, so I'm sure you and your listeners will know, but epistemology being all about where knowledge comes from. or I would argue perceived knowledge. So in terms of where, so I was asking myself the question, or a number of questions. Where does perceived autism knowledge come from? I like things in sets of three. So 3 questions that I posed to myself. Secondly, why is so much of this knowledge flawed? Because I believe it is. And thirdly, as a direct result of autism knowledge being flawed, what damage does that do to the autistic community? And I sort of essentially frightened myself, but I didn't frighten myself. I think, I mean, it might sound like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but ever since I first started proactively engaging with literature around autism, which was before my first interview for an autism-related job, and I went to the library and went to the local section on psychology and read about autism, and I believed it. And then I met autistic people, and I was like, "You can't be a real autistic person. You don't bear any resemblance whatsoever to the depictions in these books." And that was decades ago. My genuine concern, and I am seriously frightened about this, is that much of that same knowledge or perceived knowledge is still being is still prolific in today's age. So I run courses on autism, and a lot of the courses are around challenging these preconceptions or these, what I refer to as autism myths. Even the word autism, like, you know, in terms of that kind of sense of self and that kind of depiction of a egocentric, inward looking individual, doesn't bear any resemblance to most autistic people that I know, who tend to be very egocentric less, or ego less, and very outward looking. And actually that's part of the reason why so many autistic people find that their sense of self is hugely problematic, because they don't think about themselves anywhere near as much as the outside world would tell them that they would do. And actually I'd like to come back to that maybe later on, around understanding of self and understanding one's own autistic authenticity as a barrier towards developing trauma, because I think that's absolutely crucial. So I am a senior lecturer in autism. That's just a title. And people tell me, like you, before we came on air, you were saying, oh, you know, learning from an expert. There's no way in a million years I'm an autism expert. I think if anybody claims to be an autism expert, you can shut them down and make the assumption that they're not, because every single new autistic person I will meet will teach me something new. And I don't know the majority of autistic people. So I think it's absolutely fair to say you can have expertise within a particular component of autism, mine being teaching and learning, presumably, and research and what have you. And I'm lucky enough that the majority of my students are autistic themselves. So I'm engaging with autistic people literally on a day-to-day basis. And despite the fact that I'm an academic and I do research and I write books, I'm on to my 9th one now, I think it is. Well, I know it is, because I do things in sets of 3s. It was a big decision to go from 6 to 7, because I thought, I'm going to have to write another 3. But anyway, that's another story. The vast majority, absolute vast majority of any kind of knowledge and understanding that I've got about autism comes directly from the autistic population. It doesn't come from necessarily from research and so on and so forth. The lived experience of autistic people, and over the decades, the hundreds or thousands of individuals that I've engaged with who have so generously shared their lives with me and their children's lives with me, that's where my understanding comes from, limited though that still is.
Just, I think, for our viewers, so basically now we kind of have the spectrum, neurodivergent, all of those different titles that, for people that are brand new to being exposed to this, it's like, I don't have a clue kind of what they're talking about. It used to be called autism, and then there was Asperger's and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, can you just kind of give an overview of the spectrum now and what, how people understand it? And then secondly, can you define some of the myths that came up around autism from those early books that are still sadly out there? I think that would be a real good starting point for people, just to kind of have a framework for understanding our talk.
I think they're actually similar questions. So I would, and by the way, I apologize in advance. I don't know who's listening to this apart from you guys. And I don't know you guys either. So if you hate what I'm saying, don't blame me. I think I'm justified in saying what I'm going to say, but I'm well aware that I'm not necessarily a lone voice in the wilderness, but I'm well aware that it goes against the consensus, for example, of the diagnostic manuals, DSM and ICD, both of which I think are hugely flawed. So you mentioned the term spectrum. Going back to what I was saying about autistic epistemology, the actual diagnosis, and I don't like the term diagnosis either, which I can come back to if you want me to, but the actual diagnostic terminology is autistic spectrum disorder. Okay? I have issues with all three of those words. So I've touched on my problems with the word autism. One of my favorite ever titles of an assignment, actually, I love titles. I love coming up with titles. And I came up with an assignment title with one of my autistic students, and the title was, "Is Autism an Appropriate Moniker for Autistic People?" And he did a deep dive into that kind of origins and the etymology of the word autism and why actually it might be problematic in itself. Going back to the other two words, disorder and spectrum, I think it's just cruel, as well as not being valid, to refer to autistic people as disordered human beings. I think that's a disgrace. I think I find it bewildering that we're even allowed in this day and age to brand autistic people as disordered, because it's just categorical, as far as I'm concerned, categorically not true. And then the term spectrum, and everybody, or not everybody, most people love this term. It's, oh, you're on the spectrum. Where are you on the spectrum? The issue being is, all those years ago, Lorna Wing and Judy Gould did a study, all those years ago, in 1978, they did a study called the Camberwell study. They published it in 1979, and they introduced the concept of spectrum. I sound like I'm name dropping here, but I had Judy and Lorna in my car, in the back of my car once. We were chatting about it. And I sort of hesitantly started, I mean, these were like, gurus in the world of autism, and I was some menial, I don't know why I had them in the car. But I was sort of tentatively going, I've got real issues with this term spectrum. And the problem is that actually Judy and Lorna developed the concept of the term spectrum to identify the heterogeneity of the population, the diversity of the population, which was great. So they were saying, look, you can come under the umbrella of autism and be completely different people at the same time. The issue was that then people, I think, misunderstood, and they started having depictions. I used to go to conferences and people would have depictions of rainbows or lines or whatever and say, this is the autism spectrum, and here's severe autism at one end and here's Asperger's syndrome or mild autism at the other. And going back to DSM, and I say I have major issues, clinicians are encouraged to perpetuate this in terms of saying, okay, what level of support is this autistic person? Now, I've got major problems with that. If I was to ask you, what level of support do you need? Presumably your immediate reaction is, well, it depends on what you're asking me to do, mate. Like, I can't answer that question. It's not as binary as I need support X. And I understand why we might need to identify individuals' support needs at any given time in any given environment, but it's not as binary to say you are here on the spectrum. So I absolutely refute the concepts of gradings of autism. And I know people will say, oh no, but you clearly never met my child. My child is severely autistic. And what they usually mean is my child has comorbidity of autism and additional learning disabilities. Or they will say, oh, you don't understand, this person is high functioning or this person is low. Functioning labels are hugely, hugely problematic, because autism in and of itself does not lead to functioning. And this is where I came up with my, I have to say, self-professed golden equation. I refer to it as a golden equation. You can be the judge. But my equation is autism just means autism. That's all it means. So if you've got an autistic child, nobody in their right mind should ever say, well, if you're an autistic child, this is going to lead to X, Y, and Z, because we don't know. All it means is if you're an autistic child, you will die an autistic adult. That's all it means, essentially. But we do know, in fact, presumably one of the reasons why I'm here is because so many autistic people have trauma. So to take trauma as a very good example, actually, if I'm saying being autistic does not automatically equate to being traumatized, and yet being autistic and living as an autistic person massively increases risk, and we know statistically it does increase risk of then having trauma, what's the bit that's missing? So that's when I came up with my golden equation of autism plus environment equals outcome. So if the outcome in this context is trauma, and we accept that we can't change somebody being autistic, because you can't, and nor should you be trying to. The only thing left, if you want to change the outcome, i.e. trauma, the only thing left to change is the environment. And the environment leads to functioning. So I had an amazing, I've got loads of examples. You might take an autistic person and put them in a particular situation where they feel safe, and they're engaging in a way that suits them and communicating in a way that suits them. And the sensory environment is fantastic, and they are functioning at a superior level compared to their non-autistic counterparts. You then take them out of that comfort zone and put them in an environment that is sensorially chaotic and people are communicating in a way that doesn't suit it or whatever, and their productivity goes down. They are the same autistic human. You haven't changed that human being, but you've changed the environment and subsequently changed the outcome. So saying you're high functioning, to me, doesn't mean anything unless you're going to put in the word intellectually high functioning, in which case it actually tells you something about the individual. But otherwise, I've got real issues with that misconception of spectrum where you're kind of mildly autistic, which makes no sense whatsoever, or severely autistic, which equally makes no sense.
So far, just so you know, Luke, like I'm agreeing with you on all of that. You're kind of, I think, when you're working in a world every day and you get kind of some of the DSM and psychological stuff that comes out, you go, I think that might actually be doing damage to people. And so I fully agree with kind of where you're going with all of this. Can I just back you up a little wee bit and just define? So if a parent takes their child to a doctor, psychiatrist, because they suspect that something's not quite right and the doctor diagnoses them as autistic, what's the doctor basing that on? What are the criteria that would be used to categorize a child as autistic?
Well, I'm not a clinician, so I don't get involved. I mean, I critique that side of things.
Yes.
But within the UK, they traditionally use the DSM diagnostic criteria. The issue that I've got is it's a comparable model against a perceived norm. So essentially, I mean, it's incredibly neuronormative. So by neuronormative, what I mean is, so ethnocentricity, as you'll know, is that concept that there's a population or a group or a religion or a community or a culture that is better than the others. So that's, and obviously, fairly obviously, the world is rife with examples of ethnocentrism. This isn't a political podcast, so I'm not a political person. I'm not going to go down that road. But you will all be able to open a newspaper or read it or whatever and see examples, clear examples of ethnocentricity. And neuronormativity is the kind of neurological component of ethnocentricity, which is saying there's a right way of your brain working, and if your brain diverts from that right way, then your brain is in the wrong, and we're going to brand that as being a disordered brain. And neurodivergence comes under that umbrella, unfortunately, within DSM. So autism is classified as a disorder, and you have to be considered impaired in a number of different components. But those impairments, and I can't stand that, because the autistic brain is not impaired. It's just not the same as somebody else's brain. If everybody's brain were the same, the world would be an incredibly boring place. I always use the analogy, and please, just take this with a pinch of salt. But, and of course, there are loads and loads of similarities in terms of characteristics and behaviors and so on and so forth between the autistic person and the non-autistic person, which is why it's so ridiculous to talk about autistic behavior, because there's no singular behavior or set of behaviors that is unique to the autistic population that isn't shared elsewhere. So that's when people say, oh, yeah, we've got autistic traits. It goes back to what you were saying about myths. It's like, what does an autistic trait mean? If I, and I'm not saying autistic people are different species, but I have got a cat. My cat is called Little Miss Squirrel. Okay. And I used to have a dog. She's no longer with us, but pretend Sandy is still with us. Sandy Pancake Waggy Eyes, to give her a full title. If I was to say to Little Miss Squirrel, oh, Little Miss Squirrel, I've just noticed you're a furry quadruped with a tail. You've got dog traits. Oh, Sandy Pancake, you're a furry quadruped with a tail. You've got cat traits. If I was to then judge Little Miss Squirrel, when I woke up this morning, I thought you were a terrific cat. I've now observed you. You haven't barked once. You haven't chased the post person. You're a rubbish dog. You're an impaired dog. And I was to flip that around and say to Sandy, I think you're an impaired cat. That would be A, ludicrous, B, massively unfair, and C, potentially very damaging and harmful to those individuals. I think that's essentially what we're doing with autistic people in that incredibly neuronormative way, saying, look, your brain is not good enough compared to this seemingly right way of being. And it's only the right way of being because it's in the majority. That's the only reason, I think. The autistic brain, there's nothing wrong with the autistic brain. But the reality is autistic people suffer, not from being autistic, but suffer by living in an autistic way in a world that is absolutely not designed for them. So if a cat was to be living in a set of kennels that was set up for dogs, it would probably be at a massive disadvantage and and there would be an increased chance of that animal being traumatized. In the same way that being in a very much a neurominority, i.e. being an autistic person in what I refer to as the predominant neurotype world, you are a huge disadvantage. And you may appear to be hugely disabled, and people make the assumption is you're disabled because you're autistic, not it's the environment that's disabling you because everything is set up in a way that doesn't suit you. And I think unless you've experienced being in that kind of neurominority yourself, it is so difficult for people to empathize and understand just how against the autistic person the world actually is. So I've got, as a golden equation, I've got a golden notion, I've got three: golden notion, golden concept, one of which states everything needs to, at least we need to consider everything for the need for it to be translated before applying it to the autistic individual. And that's everything. Like from the moment you open your mouth to the way in which we socialize, to the way in which we educate, to the way in which we employ people, to the way in which, etc. Literally everything. Because at the moment, the world is set up for the predominant neurotype, literally in all ways, which is why for most people, you don't have to think too much about how to engage and how to socialize and how all of those sorts of things, because it's already set up for you, that pathway. So your energy can go into being productive and being you and all those sorts of things. If you have to expend units of energy for every single component of every single minute of your day to just tread water, to just meet the same threshold, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. And I think that's actually just the average state of play that most autistic people find themselves in.
Two things that I wanted to add from my own experience that I hope complements what you've just said, which to me was beautiful. When I first started into this field and started dealing with people with autism, I started reading broadly about it, but I really loved what the indigenous culture said about people with autism, schizophrenia, all of that. And it's like, they're different. There's no pathological diagnosis here. These people are different. We have to accept them. We have to nurture what they are, and they're going to have strengths that nobody else has. And we need to appreciate these very special people and at times kind of gifts from the Creator. And that really helped me. And what I began to realize as I worked in this field is, if I was to go back 60 some years as a child and be taken to a psychiatrist, I would probably have been diagnosed on the spectrum if it was today. But what I'm very appreciative of is my parents understood that my brain operated a bit differently than other kids, and I didn't relate in the superficial social world. I thought differently. And socially, I just didn't really enjoy it, wasn't comfortable with it. I would rather be thinking and thinking deeply and reading and all of that. And so what I realized is, because they accepted me totally and made space for me to be who I was and nurtured it, is why we have the stuff that I do today. And I gradually learned kind of social skills and how to function in that world, but it wasn't my comfort zone. My comfort zone was in a very different world. And so I just appreciate so much what you're saying is, we got to get beyond kind of pathologizing these people to accepting and nurturing and making space for them in this world where we try to say this is the normal, healthy, right way. We got to broaden that quite a bit. So thank you for that.
100%. It's even this kind of this idea that if you're non-speaking, there's something wrong with you. Like, communication is communication. Like, doesn't have to be speech, and you're sort of branded as inferior if, for whatever reason, speaking takes too much energy or is too traumatic, too stressful, whatever. Like, if you can communicate in other ways, that's just as valid. Just because everybody else does it in that way doesn't mean to say that you're inferior if you don't engage with things in that way. And I think it's really interesting what you say about the acceptance of difference. And we just don't, as a society, we just don't do it. Like, difference is almost branded almost always as unless you're different because you're exceptional in terms of sporting or financial wizardry or whatever. But if you're socially different, oh dear, that's a no-no. And then all of a sudden you become an outcast to a certain, well, not always, obviously, but you certainly increase that risk. But going back to the concept of neuronormativity and what I said about diagnosis, and I do just want to briefly touch on the impact of language and the concept of microaggressions, which obviously came from America in terms of back in the 70s, everyday language was considered microaggressions to the Black community because of the way in which people were unconsciously or subconsciously referring to Black people through ignorance, was actually exposing these Black communities to everyday microaggressions in terms of language. Now, I think, and this is just what I think, but I think we can apply that to today's autistic population. And I think it's a disgrace. I just don't understand how we are allowed to do that. So having autism pathologized within DSM, for example, to actually brand people, say you are not even going to be allowed to be autistic. You have to be disordered in order for us to allow you to be your own authentic self. And that term diagnosis, in terms of the etymology of the term diagnosis, got two different meanings, but the one that's the majority is to find out what is wrong with somebody in order to fix them. You go to the doctors when you think that you're ill in order to be diagnosed with your illness, to somehow find a cure or somehow get it fixed or alleviated or whatever it is. And yet we still diagnose autism. The underlying subconscious microaggression, I would suggest, is we're suggesting to you that there's something wrong with you that needs fixing. And that is the common narrative that autistic people are exposed to day after day after day. And then even in terms of behavioral conformity, you need to behave more like these people. You need to make friends. You need to communicate in this way. You need to... I sometimes tell a story at the beginning of conferences about levels of anxiety, because I was very anxious once. The very first time I ever spoke at a conference, I was very, very stressed. And I was thinking, well, I had to speak for 2 hours to this audience of a couple hundred people. I thought, well, I can talk about autism for 2 hours. I don't have a problem with that. But what if somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer? And back in those days, I was not as confident as I am now about autism and talking about autism. So I thought, okay, well, what I'll do is I won't invite questions. I'll just go in, talk at them, and then run away. And this elderly lady right at the front put her hand up within actually, the first thing that happened was somebody fell asleep and started snoring. And that didn't do my confidence any good whatsoever. His mum introduced me to him after. He said, it's my son, he's autistic. I'm so sorry that he fell asleep. And he looked really puzzled and said, Mum, why are you saying sorry? I was tired and he was boring. I was like, yeah, you got to love that level of honesty. Absolutely brilliant. Anyway, this woman was waving her hand at the front, and I was like, oh God. And in the end, I had to acknowledge her. And she said, so, what about cats? And I was like, have I misheard you? What about cats? And she said, cats. She was very enthusiastic. I said, well, yeah. And she said, are they any good for autistic people? And I was thinking, oh God, I have no idea what you're talking about. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, I got to know her and her husband, and she said, married for 30 years, we don't have any kids, and my husband doesn't tend to communicate with me about anything over and above quite practical issues. I know he loves me and he knows I love him, but sometimes life could be a little bit lonely, and it seemed a little bit surface. And this almost sounds like I'm talking about an autistic stereotype, so bear with me. And he said, after we'd been married for about 20 years, I was driving home and I'd stopped at traffic lights. I was looking around the way you do, and there was a pet shop and it was selling kittens. So I thought, I'm going to get myself a kitten. And he said, this is what prompted this question about cats. I took the kitten home, and as soon as my husband met the kitten, he started talking to the cat. And she said, and I sat and listened. And she said, this is word for word, and this is decades old, this example. She said, I learned more about my husband in 3 days than I had done in 20 years. And then she said, then I came up with a brainwave, waited till my husband was in the room and the cat. I started talking to my husband via the cat. And she said, now we just communicate via the cat. And I got to know the husband, and I asked him, why can you just like info dump everything that's in your brain to the cat, but not your wife? And he said, because when I was a child, I learned the hard way to shut up. He said, I was a curious child. I was inquisitive. I wanted to understand the world. I wanted to understand knowledge. And I got traumatized by not knowing what was okay to say. He said, sometimes I'd ask a question and I'd get an answer. Other times I'd ask a question and someone would go, oh, that's a stupid thing to say, or you don't mean that, or that's ridiculous, or now's not the time, now's not the way. He said, in the end, I was so stressed about, I don't know what reaction I'm going to get, that I just gave up. Apart from anything just beyond the most surface of communication. He said, but cats don't judge you in that way. And he said, the cat's not going to come back and tell me that I'm stupid or that I'm wrong or whatever, just for being different to most people. It taught me such a massive, massive lesson in terms of understanding life through the autistic lens, compared to being exposed constantly to these microaggressions. You're in the wrong. You shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't do it, which genuinely, I mean, for this guy, it lasted him his entire lifetime.
I love that example. And to me, it combines kind of what you're talking about, the environment and the trauma that causes their brain to function differently because the environment, and then you put them with a cat and all of a sudden there's a very different response. So Andy, I'm going to kind of let you start on some of your questions because I know you're chomping at the bit there.
No, I've loved this so far, and I really, the conversation about the norm, just looking how, in a way, we live in this shaming culture, and that there's the culture itself looking for some idea of perfectionism. And what I really love about, and I've listened to you before, is this capacity to look to the individual and to accept and open up to this authenticity in the individual. And I have a ton of curiosity, and one of the first things I hear about a lot is masking. And I know masking is a thing that even codependents do. So it's a complex trauma term as well. And so, there's this effort to appear normal or okay or blend in. And so I was wondering if you could kind of talk about masking and, for somebody who has spent a lot of their life masking, how do you begin to take that mask off? What's the process, and maybe what does it mean for that individual to be able to remove that mask? What do they find underneath?
That's an amazing question. First thing I would say about masking, which is, and I'm not swerving the question, I'll come back to it, but it's just while it's in my head. And again, you'll know about Wittgenstein's lion, right? Where so Wittgenstein, the amazing philosopher, would say, if a lion was to join us here on this riverside chat, and the lion was speaking English to us, and we're speaking English to the lion, we wouldn't understand each other. Even though we're using exactly the same language, the meaning behind the words that we're using come from such a completely differing worldview that we still wouldn't be able to understand each other. Now, I think it's worth considering Wittgenstein's lion within narratives when we try and apply those narratives both to the predominant neurotype and the autistic population. And masking is this is why I bring up Wittgenstein's lion now, because masking is a brilliant example of when it's applied to one population, it actually means something quite different compared to being applied to a different population. So I'll talk about masking in delivering training or whatever about autism. And a lot of people, particularly teachers, will say, "Oh, well, that's not autism. I mask as well." And non-autistic populations say, "Oh, yeah, we all mask." And I think we're using the same word. And as I said earlier, I like things in sets of three. So I'll go back with three questions. Say, right, I think I might be wrong. I think what you're saying is you adapt your own behavior to fit the needs of whatever role it is you're playing at that time. Question number one, are you consciously aware that you're doing it all the time? Secondly, does it take an enormous amount of energy to do it? And thirdly, do you need recovery time as a direct result of your masking? And almost invariably, the answer is no, no, and no. In which case I'll say, well, I don't think they're the same thing then. I think we're using the same word, but I think autistic masking is a completely different life experience. Now, I'm not saying all autistic people who are masking are always consciously aware, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I am absolutely convinced that there's this huge expectation on society to mask, for you to mask, for autistic people to mask. We even encourage it in some ways. So people will have interventions and try and change autistic, natural, authentic autistic behavior, i.e. the way that the individual feels natural to behave. So say, for example, if somebody's stimming and they love stimming and it enables their brain to work really effectively and they're taught at school not to stim, that's essentially forced masking in terms of our behavioural level. We used to say, no, don't do that. That's distracting, or it means that you're not listening. In fact, it actually means the opposite. If I'm stimming, it means I am listening to you. And actually, you've just forced me to not listen to you, or whatever. So I have real issues with those sorts of, in inverted commas, interventions. But I'm absolutely convinced that being autistic, you in non-autistic friendly environments, costs huge amounts of energy. Including the energy it takes to mask, which again puts you at a huge disadvantage if you're expending enormous amounts of energy. And I've written about this, I've broken energy down into 9 different types of energy, so 3 threes, obviously. And I don't think most people are aware of like social energy or processing energy, or people think about energy being physical energy, sometimes mental energy. What about emotional energy? What about, in terms of, I'm chatting to you guys here. I'm loving it because I get to talk about autism, which is my favorite subject, autism and triathlons. But I love talking about autism. So I'll get an enormous amount of energy out of chatting to you guys. If you then turned it around and said, how to actually, I want to talk to you about something that I'm completely uninterested in, all of a sudden my energy is going to be vacuumed out of me. You'll turn into mood hoovers. I'll be like, oh God, I never want to see those guys again. As opposed to, oh God, I could do this all day. You literally. So even social energy and communication energy is going to change depending on who it is you're engaging with, when, where, about what, and so on and so forth. If we can start tracking those energies for our kids and for people that we care for and care about, or ourselves, then that enables us tomorrow to figure out, actually, no, I'm not going to engage with that person because I'll have run out of spoons. I'll have run out of energy. I need to keep talking about triathlons. People talk about burning matches in terms of energy during race day. And I think that's a lovely analogy. I've written about it in my blog about, autistic matches. And you only have on a day-to-day basis a limited number of matches. There was you'll know about the Women's Rugby World Cup that recently finished. Sorry for you guys, but we won. And our amazing centre Meg Jones, she was I was listening to her on a podcast, and she said, "Energy is my currency." I was, oh God, wish I'd thought of that phrase. And straight away I thought, yes. Energy is your currency. You really, really, really don't want to be in debt. And it's a really useful analogy in terms of if you're masking to such a degree that your energy levels are depleted, you literally cannot cope long term. It's impossible. Having said that, and this is, I'm covering, and you might have to come back and remind me what your original question was, but in terms of masking, if you then have an understanding that you are autistic and you are interested in your own authenticity, and you become more consciously aware that you have been masking and that other people don't mask in the way that you do, which is a very common occurrence, because being autistic, how do you know what you don't know? How do you know that not everybody is masking constantly? It might not ever even occur to you. And actually, in terms of understanding your own autism, leads to incredible insights in terms of where you're then expending your energy and where you should or maybe shouldn't do it. And that's when people talk about unmasking and say, okay, well, I'm going to choose actually to be authentic. It's an incredibly brave thing to do. And it can lead to problems. Certainly even with partners, for example, people are like, you never used to be like that. I don't like the new version of you. It's like, well, actually, this is me. The old version of me wasn't really me. This is the one that, and if you don't like me, this is literally who I am. And society doesn't like it when people unmask and become, or often society doesn't like it because that is not conforming, and people don't seem to like it when people don't conform unless you demonstrate that you're highly successful at doing so. So I don't conform particularly. Like, I don't go into the office. I almost never go into the office. Lots of my colleagues go into the office and they seem to enjoy it. I find the whole idea terrifying. Anyway, I'd get myself into trouble, wouldn't I? But I'm highly, highly, highly productive not being in the office. So I, in inverted commas, get away with it because I'm extraordinarily productive by being in an environment where I can get my head down and get a load of work done. So I sort of I'm allowed to do things maybe in a non-conforming way. And I think absolutely, if we can engage with people who don't do things in a way that's conforming to society, but are still productive in and of their own right, absolutely brilliant. Go for it.
I love that. And so I really like this use, there's some level of, coming into your authenticity, recognizing your own wholeness as an individual. But I love this use of the word non-conforming. And to me, that sounds like something that would take a lot of courage to do. How do you move into this acceptance of yourself where you can be non-conforming and welcome yourself for that?
Absolutely 100% spot on. It does take an enormous amount of courage. And I need to be careful because it doesn't always work well for the individual, because it's the society that needs changing rather than the individual themselves. If you're not going to be accepted as your own authentic self, there's only a limited amount that you can do to try and persuade other people to change their worldview on difference. So I think there's a number of things. First of all, I think one of the best things you will ever gift an autistic person is engaging with them around understanding their own autistic authenticity. So if you're autistic and you don't know it because you've never been identified, or you're autistic and you do know it, but you don't actually understand what that means to you, or thirdly, you believe you know what it's like to be autistic because you've read the books, going back to that concept of autistic epistemology, and you've got it wrong, so you're applying misinformation to yourself, that's going to put you at a massive disadvantage, because the decisions that people make have got to be based on parameters that are specific to them. Yeah. And most people who are autistic, I think anyway, who either don't know they're autistic or they do know, but they don't really know what that means, will still make decisions based on other people's parameters. And then their life is not as good as a direct result, because those decisions might be useful for the predominant neurotype. They're not useful for the autistic person. So I think there's an absolute direct correlation between understanding one's own authenticity that is unique to you as an autistic person, and making decisions that are going to benefit you and advance you in terms of your own well-being and reduce risk of trauma. Unfortunately, it's incredibly rare to allow for individuals to be allowed those opportunities, partly because society still doesn't really understand, have a good grasp on what being autistic means. So, for example, we still, it's so nonsensical. I just find it extraordinarily illogical. So I wouldn't say to you I don't know, you're male, but hang on a minute, I know another male and they're nothing like you. So are you sure you're male? The most bizarre thing to do. Like, you'd fall off each other. What are you talking about? We do it with autistic people all the time. Figuratively, not literally all the time. The number of times, like, an autistic person say to me, "Oh yeah, I disclosed to my neighbour," and they said, "You sure? Because I've got a friend who's got a autistic daughter, and she's nothing like you." And the response is, "I'm a 50-year-old man. Your friend's daughter's a 3-year-old girl. Just because we share the same diagnostic label of autism. What on earth does that mean in terms of you think we should be alike? And yet we do that. We don't do it for other populations, but we do it when it comes to being autistic. So as an autistic person, you live and breathe these constant myths under my umbrella of autistic epistemology, and therefore keep making those same errors of judgment based on parameters that are not designed for you. So to have that understanding of your own individual, unique authenticity, while you may share all sorts of experiences with other autistic people, you're still your own unique person. And the better you know yourself, the more content you're likely to be around then making those judgments. When I go to such and such a job interview, am I going to go as my autistic, authentic self, or am I going to put whatever? That's down to you to decide. But knowledge is power, and genuine knowledge about your own authenticity is hugely, hugely beneficial. The flip side being is you're exposing yourself to risk of trauma if you're judging yourself against the wrong set of parameters constantly. Because if you do, like, I think this kind of impairment model, this disorder model, or what have you, is autistic people do not make very good non-autistic people, in the same way that non-autistic people make rubbish autistic people. They're just different people. So the sooner we encourage or allow autistic people to stop going down that very binary judgment neuronormative model, which almost the entirety of autistic epistemology is based on, the better for them.
If I can just jump in, Luke, to me, just to bring, again, for our listeners, something together for them. What we talk all regularly about the subtle ways that people experience complex trauma so they don't feel safe. They're made to feel unsafe in their world. They can't be authentic because they'll be judged, and that makes it unsafe. And so you think of a black kid growing up in a white neighborhood, they always are made to feel different. They're always made to feel less than. So they develop not just, I feel in danger, but also a subtle belief, a shame belief that something's wrong with me. I'm not good enough, becomes joined to that. And that's very much in their core beliefs about their identity. And I think that's the same thing you're saying with autism is if you grow up in a world that basically says you're different, therefore you're less than, you start believing that. And so when Andy talks about becoming authentic, is you want to become authentic, but now you got shame that says, but I actually believe I'm not good enough. I'm less than these people. So to be authentic, you got to fight through an extra layer now, a shame belief layer that I think understanding, hey, I'm different, but that's okay. I can be authentic, but I can only be authentic with safe people that kind of get it and accept me, because to try to be authentic in this world where I'm judged and condemned and pathologized is continually traumatizing me. So I have to learn to detect safe and unsafe people as part of my own becoming authentic.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I think a lot of autistic people I know, or a significant percentage of autistic people I know who have kind of gone through it and come out the end, will start off their autism identification by saying, I'm not autistic. I don't want to be autistic. What they actually mean is, I don't want to be what society believes autism to be. Because you are totally I keep going on about it kind of autism knowledge, but genuinely up against it on a day-to-day basis. And if that's who you're led to believe you are, and there's no affinity between the world's model of autism and you, where does that leave you? Like, it's like, well, that's not me, but then who am I then? And this sense of guilt and shame. So it's very timely, actually. I've just, the latest book that I wrote, I've written into, I like neologism, made up words. So I've made up a new word. So again, don't bother Googling it, because I've just made it up. But based on the concept of religious guilt. So scrupulosity is essentially the word for religious guilt. So scrupulosity, sorry. So I came up with scrupulosity, which is kind of my take on autistic guilt. And this kind of concept that autistic people often grow up feeling bad about who they are. Not because they are bad, but because the world has made them feel inferior and they're the ones in the wrong. And that's why so many autistic people are so apologetic constantly. It's because the immediate assumption, if something's gone wrong in the world, it must be my fault. because that's what I've been led to believe. So going back to those microaggressions, it's not just narratives, it's actual experiences where you are the one that's causing a problem. Now, you also mentioned, Tim, about the concept of safety. And I've also written about the concept, again, a new concept I've been developing around autistic safety. And if you actually ask groups of the predominant neurotype, in the main, obviously this can't be everybody, but okay, well, when was the last time you felt unsafe? So many people are able to identify a specific time, an event where they felt unsafe because it's unusual. So they're able to remember it and recall it and actually say, oh yeah, I was going past these drunk people and somebody shouted or whatever. You ask populations of autistic people and they look at you as if you're a bit like, and they say, well, I always feel unsafe, or I feel unsafe when I wake up, or I feel unsafe when I go out the front door, or I feel unsafe when I have to go to school, or I feel unsafe whenever my phone rings, etc., etc., etc. Because you're always being exposed to risk. And obviously being exposed to risk means you feel unsafe, which again then massively increases risk of complex trauma. So I think going to school, for example, something as inverted commas simple as going to school, going back to what I was suggesting earlier, if everything is set up to suit the majority and you're not part of that majority, you are at risk. So even just going to school day after day after day, and you don't have any choice, and you're expected to conform, and you're expected to fit in, you're expected, etc., etc., etc. No wonder school trauma is such a real thing and does so much long-lasting damage to autistic adults. So going back to what I was saying right at the beginning, being autistic does not equate to being traumatized, but living as an autistic person massively increases risk of trauma. So we're clearly getting something fundamentally very, very wrong.
Excellent. Okay, Andy, back to you, because I got another list of questions forming in my mind too.
Yeah. I like this, the talking about kind of moving to safety, and as it relates to trauma, and then with the conversation about going to the authenticity, earlier you mentioned like parameters, and I was just wondering is there clarity around like the different types of parameters? Could you talk a little bit about some of these parameters that you can look at yourself, or that for somebody working or talking to somebody, to help us understand that more?
Again, absolute genius question. I have not got a good answer to this, because you need a safe person to engage with, or safe people maybe, but that person also has to have an exemplary understanding of autism and how it might specifically impact on you as an individual. And it's that kind of journey you go through together to work out who you are and to set up your own set of unique parameters against which you can judge yourself. Now, I'll give you a really, really simplistic example. I used to get invited, I still get invited to speak at conferences. It used to be the case I'd turn up at conferences and I would be appalling. I'd just be the worst speaker there. And I used to just get so stressed about it. And then I remember very clearly just thinking one day, why am I so rubbish? A, why do I keep getting asked to speak at conferences when I am so rubbish? B, why am I so rubbish? And C, what am I supposed to do about it? And I started trying to work out, I was thinking, right, well, the people that are asking me to speak at conferences are people, say, for example, a head teacher at a school said, oh, you came into training for our staff. You were absolutely brilliant. We're setting up a conference. We'd like you to come and speak at our conference. And I'd think that's all absolutely valid. I am really good at training. This sounds really arrogant, but I'm quite good at talking about autism. So yeah, I was good at that training. Why am I not just doing that at a conference? And it goes back to masking and lack of authenticity. I was trying to pretend to be Professor Chris Gilbert, who was on the conference scene at a time, who was very eloquent, very well spoken, always wore a suit and a tie. So I'd dress up in my suit and tie and try and be Professor Chris Gilbert. I'm never going to be Professor Chris Gilbert. And I was totally inauthentic and therefore completely rubbish at speaking at conferences. And apart from a horrible wedding I had to go to, that's another story. That's the last time I ever wore a suit. So I will turn up. I'm also, or have been, an expert witness in court. I will still turn up in my jeans and a t-shirt to do an international keynote at a conference, or to go and be an expert witness at court. It raises lots of eyebrows. Absolutely. And you turn up and say, "Oh, I'm here for the conference." They say, "Oh, sorry, we can't see you on the delegate list." It's like, "No, mate, I'm your keynote speaker." And the fear in people's eyes when they look at you is like, "What? We've invited this creature to come and speak to open our international conference." But so the process that I go through is I've got a set of moral, ethical boundaries, and I will ask myself the question: what impact is my action going to have in the short term and the long term on me, and in the short term and the long term on the people for whom I'm engaging with? And if I can go through that, by the way, it's an exhausting thing to do, like even to the point where I'll practice what I'm going to say before I say it, to try and make sure it's unambiguous, it's as clear as possible, that people aren't going to get upset by it, and that I've actually gone through this due process. So when I go to a conference, my process is I am being asked to knowledge transfer. Now, if my knowledge transfer is going to be more effective with me wearing jeans and a t-shirt than it is me wearing a shirt and tie, then I'll go with jeans and t-shirt, even though that might not conform to the norm. I'm still ticking my boundaries in terms of, now, whether I get it right or wrong, I can still go to bed without that constant rumination of, "Oh, I've messed up yet again." I might have messed up, in which case I'll learn from it and redress the situation in terms of changing my boundaries or parameters tomorrow. But at that moment in time, I was genuinely doing the best that I possibly could against a set of boundaries that I think are appropriate to me. You have to have an enormous amount of faith and trust in the system, but I can promise you it also works. This stems right back. The first realization I had, I guess, was when I was 12 years old. And forgive me, Mum, for saying this. I'm guessing you probably won't ever listen to this, but my mum used to insist that I made friends. She used to worry that I didn't have any friends. Okay. So I'd get home from school and say, "Go down the park and make friends." And I'd go down the park and climb up a tree and hide, or pretend that I was deaf and unable to engage with people. And it sort of worked. People left you alone. But anyway, that's another story. But I remember at 12 years old, suddenly thinking, actually, I don't need friends. This person, this figurehead in my life, who's very important, I don't think she's right. I think what she thinks is most kids are happier when they've got lots of friends, and she's applying those same values onto me. But actually, I must be an exception to the rule because friends are a pain in the ass, and I'm really not bothered. I much prefer just to read under my cover in bed and read. And that was a hugely significant moment to me to realize that society, or in this case, my mum, could actually be wrong when they applied those rules to me. And actually, sometimes those rules need to be changed when applied to any given particular individual. That's a huge thing to learn, I think. But it does take a lot of courage.
I'm just chuckling because I relate to so many of your experiences, Luke. And so when I go, I just got asked if I'd teach in class. And so the lady that sets it all up says, "Just be aware that Tim will show up in jeans and a t-shirt, and don't expect him to wear a suit and tie." And that's just him being who Tim is. And and I've had to do what you do as well, go through the little checklist. Is this going to actually hinder me, or can I be authentic here, etc.? And it's a process you just gradually learn, and you don't always get it right, but it's an important process. So again, I went through what you went through as a kid, and just realizing I don't think either my parents or society is right in setting this standard. Something's wrong here, and I'm going to choose to be different from that because that's who I am, and I'm not hurting anybody. I'm just being true to myself. And those were pivotal times in my life, looking back, where that courage to kind of stand up for who I was and not give in to having to mask was so important. If I can just switch, so kind of a beloved character in Canada is Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. So I don't know if you're going to agree with this or not, but to me, he's kind of the Hollywood's classic autistic person. And he's just who he is. He's different. His brain works different. He's socially awkward and all kinds of different things, doesn't pick up on social cues and all of that. But people learn to love him and accept him and see the kind of amazing positive. So again, it's a Hollywood version. But where I'm going with this is a question that I get asked a lot from people that are in our program with autism is somebody like Sheldon actually gets labeled as being narcissistic because he's just aware of what he needs, what he wants. He's not actually totally attuned to what everybody else wants, which is kind of societal expectation. You got to be more attuned to others than to yourself. And he's very attuned to himself, and he just puts himself out there, states his opinion, all of that stuff, and then kind of gets labeled narcissistic. And I go, autism can present as narcissism, but it's very different. Can you just speak to that? Because I think that's a confusing area for people that they've never nuanced it or kind of made a healthy distinction between the two.
Yeah, it's that judgment decision. Just quickly on narcissism. I love language. I love words. I get fascinated with what people believe, and particularly, say, for example, about narcissistic personality disorder, which is a real thing, a diagnosed, pathology, if you like. But the number of people who are narcissists massively outweigh the number of people who are diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, because one of the components of the diagnostic criteria is that this narcissistic behavior must be damaging to yourself. And of course, actually being a narcissist is very good for the individual. It's awful for everybody around them. And it just really makes me laugh that you've got this complete mismatch between how we understand and pathologize a particular disorder and the wording we have in the diagnostic criteria, which is actually diametrically opposite to the lived experience of the narcissist. Anyway, the other thing that I would say, and going back to your question, Tim, is understanding life through the autism lens and the concept of empathy. So I guess it's still common, and I think this is why people are accused of being narcissistic, actually. It's still quite common for people to assume that being autistic means you lack empathy. It's not true. It's categorically not true. Some autistic people will struggle to understand the perspectives of other people. Other people will be hyper empathizers. I, in 2008, wrote a paper called, I wrote a paper called Is Autism Really a Disorder? And then I wrote a second paper that got published called Is Autism Really a Disorder? Part 2, Rethink How We Think. And it was critiquing this idea that autistic people lack empathy. And what I came up with was a concept that I foolishly referred to as cross-neurological theory of mind. Dr. Damien Milton, brilliant autistic academic, came up with, at a similar time to me, came up with the double empathy problem, which is by far a better way of putting it. So nobody ever talks about my rather stupidly named cross-neurological theory of mind, whereas people talk about Damien Milton's double empathy problem, and rightly so. We're both saying essentially the same thing. Autistic people might lack the ability to intuitively empathize with non-autistic people, but so it's very much the case the other way around. Like, non-autistic people find it almost impossible. I'm like, well, I wouldn't have a job. I wouldn't be a senior lecturer in autism if everybody had autistic empathy, because they'd have all that knowledge already. They'd understand autistic people already. So it's my job, in a sense, to teach about autistic theory of mind, if you like, to non-autistic people, although it's a bit broader than that. So double empathy is very much a real thing. But because autistic people are in the minority, they are the ones who are then accused of having this lacking of empathy. Now, actually, let me just give you a quick example of, it's not narcissistic characteristics, if you like, but where understanding life through the autism lens is so illuminating, but so different if you don't understand it. And this is a real life example. It always gets me. I'll try and get through this without crying. And it was a mum who was saying, I do not understand why my daughter doesn't demonstrate that she loves me. My son is always affectionate with me and hugging me, and my daughter, nothing. And I just don't understand why she doesn't love me. And her daughter was non-speaking at the time. And then I wrote this in one of my books, that like I love this sort of internal narrative that people have in their heads, and these people, both of them very kindly allowed me to. So on the one hand, the mum's got this narrative, I don't understand why my daughter doesn't love me. Then you've got the daughter saying, I just don't understand when I walk up to mum and I'm that close to her and I put my head ever so slightly, so it's very, very nearly touching her shoulder, why she doesn't understand I would never do that with anybody else in the world. And that's just how much I love her. And it's just a different way of expressing the same thing. But on the one hand, being judged against, going back to what you were saying, Andy, being judged against the wrong set of parameters, because people haven't translated their understanding to understand it through the autism lens. And I think sometimes people will take behavior that they see that for the autistic person makes absolute sense and is morally and ethically right within their own grounds, and translate that to, oh, that's an example of being a narcissist. Now, I'm not saying you can't be an autistic narcissist, presumably you can, but being autistic does not make you a narcissist either. And sometimes people will misunderstand the behaviors and so on and so forth. Whereas actually, if you understand it through the autism lens, you get a completely different picture.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I don't know if this is just going to prove to be a very faddish thing, or it's going to kind of have some legs that last a while. But I've just noticed a lot on social media lately, a lot of this kind of new diagnosis of ADHD. So autism and ADHD combination. Can you just, so I want you to speak to it, but what I would say is, in my work in dealing with people with autism and in the environment of complex trauma, a lot of them talk about struggling with ADHD as well. And so I think that's partly why this new kind of term has come up. But can you just speak to that whole area of the ADHD component that some struggle with and make sense for them?
Yeah, I can only kind of share what some of my students share with me, who have that kind of combined identification. And in all honesty, some of those individuals will say it's really, really, really tough, because you've got one component who's like, oh no, I'm very monotropic, I'm flow state, I'm very focused. Then you've got the ADHD bit going, no, bing, 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 bing. And this kind of absolute chaos on one side of the brain, and then the absolute need for coordination and order in the other. And actually recognizing that, going back to what I was saying about understanding one's own authenticity and understanding that, and allowing both kind of characteristics, if you like, both sort of neurological characteristics, to engage as harmoniously as possible, and allowing yourself to move away from situations that's going to cause that chaos, or break things down so that you're actually allowing both parts of the brain to engage well together. So kind of, so say for example, chunking things down, I think is incredibly useful. So I have students who are like, well, you've asked us to do a several thousand word assignment. My brain just cannot possibly do that. It's just like one part of my brain is like, right, I'm going to go and read 1,000 books. And the other is like, no, but you've only got this. So I go, right, okay, break it down. I'm literally, so actually I used to do this. I used to, write when I was at university, on a computer or whatever, print everything out. So write literally just brain dump thousands and thousands of words. This might sound a bit odd, I don't know. Print it all out, get a pair of scissors, cut each sentence out, literally line by line, then go through them and go, right, here's the marking criteria, which sentence goes in which pile in terms of meeting the criteria. Oh, that sentence is irrelevant, I'll burn that. Then I have individual piles. I go, right, in this pile, which is the best bit of writing, and I'll order it down to the worst bit of writing, and then I'll just get rid of the bottom half. Then I'll join all those piles together, and that will make an assignment. And that actually, doing little tricks like that can work incredibly well in terms of appeasing both sides of that kind of neurological conflict, if you like. But students do sometimes talk about the loop of doom. There's a student of mine, she's just in the process of publishing a book. Hello, Rachel, if you're listening. And she introduced me to this amazing term, the loop of doom, where one side of her brain was saying this, and then it was a downward spiral. What is amazing about Rach is she says, if you reverse that And a lot of autistic people love the concepts of spirals, by the way. And I do as well. If you reverse that, and all of a sudden you've got the opposite of a loop of doom, which I haven't gone to term it, but that's like the positive things where all of a sudden you're super productive, and you can engage both in the flow state and the chaotic part of your brain at the same time.
Love that, the positive spiral. So before talking to you, I reached out to a couple of my friends, and they both happen to be women, and they would love to hear you talk about kind of gender and autism, and maybe, you know, like misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis, and kind of some of the, maybe what are some of the distinctions or some of the things that we need to be aware of, but then also like women, autistic women, to understand themselves better.
Oh no, we were getting on so well. This is where I've become deeply unpopular. Okay, just bear with me, please bear with me. So first of all, and I'm not, as I say, I'm not a clinician, so I can't speak on behalf of clinicians. But it is absolutely crystal clear that historically, society has been rubbish at identifying autistic women. Why that might be the case, you'll have to ask them. I've got my own views, but I'll keep them to myself so I don't get complaints from clinicians around the world. But for whatever reason, we've been rubbish. This kind of gender disparity, I've never understood it. I've never, ever understood why people are like, oh, autism is X times more prevalent in boys than it is in girls. I'm like, why? Like, why? I can't, nobody, and by the way, nobody can actually give a good answer as to why. Like, why is it not like roughly 50-50? Like, I just don't understand why and it presumably is roughly 50-50 in terms of the difference between prevalence and incidence. So in terms of incidence, it should be roughly 50-50. In terms of prevalence, as in actually identified individuals, clearly the boys massively still outweigh girls. So something's going wrong in terms of the identification. That's the identification process, and people have come up with all sorts of theories about why people are missing girls, and you know, all of the research used to be on white boys, and therefore that, etc. So I don't know. I still don't. I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of why girls are being missed left, right, and centre. I personally don't understand it. I have met any number of women who say, I've really struggled to get an identification. And within 5 minutes talk to them, I'm like, how have you got through life without getting one? You're so obviously autistic. Like, I don't get why people aren't picking up on it. I genuinely don't. Then we come down to the female presentation. And this is where people start throwing things at me. Okay, I have to be really careful in terms of justifying what I'm saying. If we accept that there's no such thing as autistic behavior, which we can, so there's categorically nothing that an autistic person can do at a behavioral level that marks them as being autistic. If there was, then that would be our diagnosis. Simple as that. And it's not as simple as that. So therefore, logically, there cannot be any such thing as autistic behavior. Okay, or set of behaviors. By which, like, just to reiterate that, there is no behavior or set of behaviors that is unique to all autistic people that is not displayed by non-autistic people. So we know that. That's one of the very few things we can all categorically agree on. If that's the case, then there can't be any such thing in behavioral terms as an autistic presentation. Okay, this is just my logical brain. If there's no such thing as an autistic presentation, there can't be such thing as a female autistic presentation. And people go around talking about, female presentations. Like, there's no such thing as an autistic presentation, let alone a female autistic presentation. You can't see autism. It's neurological. It's the way in which people process information and sensory stuff. You can't see it. So the idea of there being some kind of presentation seems to me to be bizarre. Now, I'm not saying that your experiences as an autistic woman might differ compared to an autistic man, but you would say that to anybody. Like, women will often experience life differently to men because they're women compared to being men. So your experience, or your friends' experiences of being autistic women, again, I would be very careful in terms of what you read about, oh yes, the presentation of women is X, Y, and Z. You are your own autistic woman. Literally, simple as that. So focus on, it's like, this well, it doesn't crack me up because it's actually quite problematic. That whole thing about imposter syndrome, this does break my heart, by the way, where people, well, there's a few things. Firstly, oh my God, you have people say, oh, I've just discovered I'm autistic. This is amazing. And then, oh, like everything makes sense. And oh, this is like, just so. They get back to you in a couple of weeks. And, oh God, Lou, I've just read Temple Grandin's book on being autistic. I'm crap at talking to cows. Maybe I'm not autistic then. It's like, don't compare yourself to anybody else. Don't compare yourself to the predominant neurotype. Don't compare yourself to other autistic people either. And that's a really, really common mistake. Then you have what really is heartbreaking, where people are like, Luke, I've been really questioning my autistic identification. You say, why is that? And people say, because I'm just doing really well in life. How desperately sad is that? That we equate being autistic with having to struggle. And if all of a sudden you're not struggling, you're no longer allowed to be autistic. And that's absolutely devastating.
You said that brilliantly, Luke, and we would agree with you. So we're nobody's going to throw anything at you here. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I think I didn't expect your answer, but given what you've been saying, there's this heavy focus on the individual and learning to see yourself and accept yourself and understand yourself as an individual. And I kind of want to put this to both you and Tim in a way. Is so when someone's trying to heal complex trauma, when there's this intermingling of who they are as autistic and complex trauma that's been overlaid possibly because of some of the places of not fitting in with society or because of the families that they've grown up in. How do we move towards this place of agency, healing, wholeness, recovery, integration? I'm making it as broad as possible and give you guys a lot of flexibility, but kind of like, how do we tease apart working with both autism and complex trauma?
Tim's probably way better at answering this than I am, but from an autism perspective, for me, like, knowledge is absolute power. The concept of blame and self-blame and trying to move away from this us and them and apportioning blame, especially when you've lived a life of blaming yourself for things that have gone wrong, to a place of absolutely accepting that things have gone wrong, but A, you're not to blame, but B, other people aren't to blame either. It's probably just that lack of understanding of who you are within that given context that you were unfortunate enough to be exposed to, that is to blame. And it can be, certainly individuals have engaged with me and said it's so uplifting to realize that you're not the one in the wrong. Constantly, those things in your childhood that had gone wrong and people blamed you, actually you can categorically relive that and recognize that you weren't in the wrong. The trick then is to not feel so angry and distressed about why you ended up getting blamed in the first place, and then totally buy into the fact is like, it wasn't anybody's fault. They didn't understand that autistic child. They didn't understand life through the autistic lens. Listen to that weird bloke Luke who talks about autistic epistemology. People still don't understand 30 years later what it means to be autistic. What chance did we stand 30 years ago when I wasn't even identified as autistic? It doesn't take away those events. And this is where this is more your kind of area. You can't not be traumatized by your events. You can't go back and change history. Those events that created trauma exist, whatever happens from the rest of you. But you can re-understand why they occurred and redress what you think about yourself as a result. And I think only by doing that, that's the beginning of going back to your lovely phrase, going back to that kind of the healing process and learn to live with why things occurred the way they did, to try and move forward in a positive way. And I'm also a massive fan, and this goes alongside chronic pain as it does with trauma, of creating similar scenarios in positive ways as opposed to in negative ways. So going back to safe people, for example, so Andy, you were talking about safe people, and I was talking about understanding one's own authenticity and recognizing who is a safe person. And the majority of people might not be safe, but you're going back to knowledge is power. If I can then go, okay, well, I'm only going to engage with those majority in a peripheral way, not in any kind of deep, meaningful way, but I am going to engage with you as my safe person. All of a sudden, I'm going to start building relationships with that trusted person, which then reduces the trauma or the residual trauma I might have had of relationships or whatever, because I'm rebuilding those memories of actually I can have a relationship with a safe person and feel safe, as opposed to what might have occurred in the past. But Tim, I'm sure you've got a much better answer than that.
Well, that was very good. I think just how I would add to it or come at it from a little different angle for people would be, what we teach our clients all the time is when a person has complex trauma, what we're asking them to do is really deconstruct a whole bunch of things. So you're deconstructing your family system. What caused it to be unsafe? So was it dad was a narcissist, mom had her own issues? Was it a belief system? All of that thing. But then what I want people to do is go beyond that and deconstruct their culture. So there's no perfect culture, and cultures create trauma often unwittingly. So just, Luke, you might appreciate this, but my paternal grandmother is from Roslin Castle in Edinburgh in the St. Clair family. And so she grew up in kind of that white aristocracy, that we're better than everybody serves us, we're entitled, etc. And she hated it, and she came to Canada and just purposely chose to live in poverty, and give all the money away and live a very simple life where she was serving everybody. And so she kind of deconstructed all of that cultural aristocracy of white supremacy and the kind of the caste system of the white world, and just saw the flaws of it, and it really violated love. It violated all kinds of different things. But she still hang on to, we're better than everybody and we're right when it comes to religion. And that was kind of what I had to deconstruct myself. But part of what I want people to realize is we develop all kinds of beliefs based on our culture and our families about ourselves that limit our authenticity, that say something's wrong with us, that we need to conform in order to be okay. And what I want people to be able to realize is authenticity never means conforming. I need to learn how to express my authenticity in loving ways, but I don't need to conform to somebody else's belief about what is normal. I need to be me. And that's what makes the world go round, is the unique diversity of all these billions of people. And it's accepting that. And so to me, it's not just being authentic that's the issue for people coming out of complex trauma. It's they've never been accepted, and they therefore haven't accepted themselves. And so to me, the starting point for most people in healing is coming to accept the parts of me that were judged, the parts of me that were despised or hated, condemned, that I learned to hate about myself. I learned to accept parts of me that everybody else validated, but I hated parts of me that others judged. And it's learning to accept. And acceptance isn't a warm emotion that, oh, I feel so good about I'm an introvert. It's, no, I just choose to accept that I might still struggle with it, but I choose to accept it. And gradually the feelings will come. And that acceptance piece to me is just foundational and so important. But so there's an academic deconstruction piece, coming to accept my authentic self as the second piece. And yeah, it's just such an important starting point.
You mentioned the word belief a number of times. It just struck me. It is so traumatic not being believed. Like, so many autistic people will say, share their experiences with me, say, look, I tried to tell people this is what it was like.
Yes.
And I was just gaslit into thinking,
Yes.
maybe this isn't my experience then. And then as adults reflect, they go, no, I was right. Like I was literally right. And those people just didn't believe me. And the necessity to absolutely fully believe what you're being told as an autistic person cannot be underestimated. Genuinely. I won't bore you with the details, but I really struggled with face blindness, prosopagnosia. Really, really struggled with understanding who people are, particularly out of context. So it's got me into all sorts of mischief over the years. Some of it quite amusing, but anyway, I was talking to a small group of people about prosopagnosia, and 3 of us were face blind, and the 4th one wasn't. And she was like, God, this is so weird. Like, this is really weird. Listening to you guys talk is just blowing my mind. And I was driving home that evening and thinking about it. And I was thinking, she cannot empathize with what it's like to not be able to recognize people's faces out of context. Like, you can't. And then I was thinking about autism, obviously, and thinking, well, actually, if you can't experience life as an autistic person, you can't empathize. It goes back to that cross-neurological theory of mind. But then that massively increases the necessity to believe what people are actually saying, as opposed to, no, you can't be like that because I'm not like that. Like, it's so important to recognize one's own limitations. Say, I don't know what it's like to be like you, therefore I'm going to believe what it is that you're telling me. And I think actually that's the opposite to most autistic people's experiences, I'm afraid.
Yeah, brilliant perspective. Just a little sidebar, Andy's face blind as well. So him and I were just talking about it last week, and just kind of what he's been struggling with and coming to terms with that. But what we teach people all the time is, if of all the clients that we deal with, once they understand their complex trauma, basically for many it boils down to they never felt seen, heard, understood, or believed. And they were trying to give their perspective on the world, but it didn't suit their parents' perspective or their parents' understanding of normal. And so they were gaslit. They were told, no, that's not the way it is. You're wrong. You're seeing. And so they learned to doubt themselves. They learned to not trust their own perceptions, their own thinking. And that just, again, produced something's wrong with me. I'm not good enough. And I'm going to believe indoctrination. Whatever you say then must be true, because I'm wrong. And so for them to begin to listen to their gut, to begin to trust their own body and voices and authenticity, again, is a massive growing, but that's a huge obstacle for when you've been gaslit for years to overcome, and to really believe your perceptions from years ago, and to be able to look back and go, yeah, I was right. Yeah, that was right. That could bring so much healing, to start to be able to trust yourself again when you've been really told you can't trust yourself. So thank you for that perspective.
Just quickly, he said, I don't know how quick it would be, but I'm part of a group that individuals with a wide range of what are termed disabilities, protected characteristics, and so on. And we've got this, and it blows my mind. And anybody listening to this can literally go and do this in their own groups. We've got a zero tolerance for apologizing for disability. So if somebody turns up and says, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't get such and such done, I hit burnout, or I had some autistic inertia, it's like, well, I'm not accepting your apology then. That's perfectly, that's your life. That's it. You can have it as an explanation. We're not allowing you to apologize for it. That's who you are. And it's just jaw-droppingly gorgeous.
I'm going to apologize to you, because I don't remember the term you came up. I remember the double empathy.
Nobody remembers mine.
But it's like just kind of recognizing like how much there's like these empathy blind spots that occur. And so, there may be somebody who's an extremely empathetic person, but it's amazing to think of how, if there's something that's just completely outside of their own lived experience, how difficult that is to understand. And I was wondering, I normally go in the opposite direction to the individual and the practical, but like, I know you've talked about like the environment. How can we create environments where we are able to be more empathetic to the places where we have blind spots, like on more of like a societal or an institutional level?
I don't know. I always, whenever people ask me questions like that, I say, "Look, ask me a question about autism. Don't ask me about weird people who won't accept stuff." Like I don't know why society is the way that it is, which is probably why I've ended up in this very niche area that I feel comfortable within. I genuinely don't know. I don't know why people don't believe autistic people or whatever. I think in terms of the empathy, that the really interesting thing is, and I don't want to alienate myself from anybody or you or your listeners, but I think one of the things towards being accepted, going back to what Tim was saying, is for people to recognize the limitations of their own empathy. To say, this is bewildering to me. I've never experienced anything like it, and nor will I. So I'm not even going to try and empathize with you. I can sympathize with you, and I can accept you, and I can believe you, and I can believe in you. I'm never going to be you. And I think that's a really beneficial way forward, rather than saying, I need to be in your shoes all of the time, because it's not possible for the non-autistic person to be able to do that. In the same way, it doesn't work the other way around either. And actually, sometimes the accepting of one's own limitations, particularly in a professional capacity, with the professional saying, look, I might have learned about autism, I might have a master's in autism, I might have a doctorate, but I still don't know what it's like to be you. And I think autistic people would embrace that genuinely and welcome that, and then feel even more heard, rather than people going, oh, well, I know what it's like to be you because I've studied autism or whatever, which actually then goes down often to the sort of gaslighting route that Tim was talking about earlier.
If I can just add one thing, like, to me, there's a distinction that I make in my mind. There's people in society that just are never going to get autism or want to understand it. But I think there's a lot of people that want to be empathetic, want to understand it, but there's actually a fear of asking questions. And what I encourage them to do is go to an autistic person and say, can I get to know you a little bit and understand you? I may never be able to empathize and totally get your world, but I sure would love to get to know you a little bit. That just breaks down walls in a big way. But I think there's a fear that these people are weird. They're different. They're not going to respond to my question. This is going to end up in conflict or a breakdown of some kind. So I'm not even going to venture into those waters of trying to get to know them. And I go, no, go there. It's rewarding to actually begin to do that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Luke.
So just to bring it up to number 3. So I've gone through the golden equation, and then so my third one is the amount of energy put into affecting change needs to warrant the intended outcome. In other words, choose which battles to fight. Sometimes you can go, you're banging on the door and you're spending a decade banging on. Actually, that door's not going to break down, or you might break one splinter of it. Those people behind the door are not going to change their minds. So maybe, just maybe, it's not saying you're giving up, but maybe you need to put that energy somewhere else that might have a much greater impact. And I think that's possibly a more productive way forward in terms of where you're going to put your energy. So if there was one thing that I could change, this is the question, one thing I could change within the autism field that everybody took on board, what would it be? And I said, it's that whatever your knowledge of autism as a culture, should we say, might be, as soon as you meet a new autistic person, you come with absolutely no prior knowledge, no assumption of prior knowledge whatsoever. And I think that would be incredibly healthy. So yes, I totally agree with you, Tim. Engage with autistic people who are willing and able to engage with you, don't then make the assumption that the knowledge that you've gleaned from them can be applied to anybody else. But what it does do is expands the horizons of your own neurology to accept that, oh, people are different to me, and they're different to each other, and they're different. And you get this a lot in the sensory world. We haven't even started talking about sensory stuff, have we? But maybe that's for a different time. But the whole sensory world is you genuinely don't know what you don't know. Most people go through their lives making the assumption that their own sensory experiences are similar to everybody else's. And then you come across an autistic person who, and sometimes they don't know that their sensory experiences are any different. It's like it was quite a while ago now, and I just made a throwaway comment. I was like, something like, oh, it's really annoying, isn't it, when the noise of the electricity is too loud and it really puts you off? And someone's like, sorry, what? I was like, well, you know, when you're listening to the electricity running through the walls and next door neighbour puts their television on and the electricity changes frequency and it's really annoying. And they were like, Luke, what are you talking about? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, well, I've never heard electricity in my life. I'm like, yes, you have. Of course you have. Everybody does. I'm like, no, I don't think so. And that realisation is like, oh my goodness. But what they didn't do, fair enough, they didn't say, Lou, you're making this up. They're like, oh my God, that's really weird, but okay, fair enough. And having that acceptance that just because you don't, but then I'm not going to then go away and go, oh, well, my sensory experiences, everybody else is going to be like that as well. Like every new, but in terms of the sensory world, it might be that the non-autistic person might, okay, what I appreciate now is that the sensory experience for at least one autistic person might differ considerably to my own. So the next autistic person I meet, I might say, okay, do you have any interesting sensory anomalies or hypersensitivities or hyposensitivities, or what might I need to do in order to meet your needs? And I will just shoehorn this in because I'm desperate to. I've come up with another concept called autistic courtesy. I wrote a book about reasonable adjustments. So under the UK law, this thing about reasonable adjustments. And as I was started to write about reasonable adjustments, I was thinking, are these reasonable adjustments? Well, they are lawful, but actually what I'm really writing about is I should be personally, and society should be proactively doing everything we can to make autistic people feel comfortable before being asked. And I started then doing some engagement with the autistic community and discussing this concept of autistic courtesy. And I try and implement it on my courses. So say, for example, before you come on my course, I will have sent you a video of me, so you know what I look like and what I sound like and where I'm coming from. And I will say things like, yes, you will be sat in a room as part of a group, but nobody's gonna there won't be any icebreakers. Nobody's gonna make you talk if you don't want to. You don't have to raise your hand to us. You can do your knitting, you can lie on the floor, blah 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 blah. So, and people kind of said, do you know what, when I start talking about autistic courtesy, people say, and my students are mature students, I say, you're the first person ever to try and take my needs into account before meeting you. And I think, I'm the first person ever, and you're in your 40s. That blows my mind. So the flip side, lack of autistic courtesy or lack of neurodivergent courtesy puts individuals into an unsafe space. And I think even if we don't necessarily get it right, but making some attempt to acknowledge individuals' own authentic humanity without making assumptions about what it is to, or who it is to be them, goes a long way towards feeling safe for those individuals.
On that subject, like I'm going to look at like from the flip side for a second. What are some considerations for like a disclosure of your own unique characteristics, like who, where, when, how? And so for me, and I'm taking this as a personal, for me, the face blindness thing is something that I discovered about myself only 10 years ago that I realized. No, it's actually, I lied. It's 20 years ago now. I'm older than I thought I was. But I'd grown up in a small town in a very sheltered home. And so I don't know if it's, so it's something that I wasn't aware of until I went to graduate school. And I came back from winter break, and all of a sudden my classmates, the 80 people that I went into school with, I didn't recognize 75 of them. And so it was just this awkward experience of like not knowing anybody. And And so, but now, like, sort of like developing this awareness and coming up with it, like, what are considerations for disclosing that to people? Because, like, I'm not going to recognize you on the street if you walk by me, if, like, with a baseball cap on, or if somebody has their hair up or their hair down.
That's a brilliant question. Just on that, when I mentioned earlier that I used to go down to the playground when my mum tried to make me make friends, and I used to pretend that I was deaf, and kids' faces, I remember them just looking a bit confused, but then like walking off. And it was only, I was in my 30s and I was reliving my childhood as you do and reflecting on things. And I thought, no wonder they thought I was strange, not only because I was doing this mime pretending I was deaf. They were the same kids I went to school with. Like, I only realised that. Like, we even used to car share with some of them, but like, because they were in a different context, I just didn't know who they were. And it was only years later, I was like, they were all in my neighbourhood. We all went to the same school. Like, they must have thought I was absolutely bonkers. They knew perfectly well I wasn't deaf. But the disclosure thing is absolutely brilliant question, because I feel very strongly about it in terms of encouraging people to apply caution in terms of who to tell. There's often this feeling, I just want to share with everybody who I am, thinking that your new knowledge and your enthusiasm of your new knowledge about yourself is going to be shared with everybody else, by everybody else, sorry. And sometimes it's not. And the number of people who say, I really regret telling so-and-so because now, like, now they're making all sorts of assumptions about me that they never used to make based on this label that actually hasn't got anything to do with me. That what their assumptions based on the label, that isn't who I am. So I'm not saying don't disclose. I'm just saying I think you need to be cautious. Like, you can't non-disclose. Once you've disclosed, you can't take it back. But you can always wait and work out who a safe person is to disclose to. And I genuinely think, like, say, for example, with an employer, like, some employers who you think might be super understanding, it might be really worth disclosing to them in order to make sure that you have your needs met. But I have come across individuals who have disclosed to their employer and all of a sudden they're out of a job, or people, they're not being promoted and so on and so forth. So you do have to take some level of consideration around that sort of disclosure. What I think we should be doing in a more general, so take employment, for example. I came up with this idea where I really like email signatures, and in brackets it says pronoun she, her, or whatever. Nobody bats an eyelid nowadays. Why can't we start a trend? You guys have got influence. You can start this trend of having email signatures saying, here's a link to a shared document within the company where you can, if you choose to, you put forward your own communication preferences. And the CEO's already done it. CEO says, I've got an open door policy between, 9 and 4. Don't ever knock on my door after 4 o'clock, or whatever. Or please don't ever phone me out of the blue, email me instead, or whatever. You don't have to disclose, I am autistic, therefore blah, blah, blah. It's just common. It's just done. That's completely free of charge. Doesn't put the onus of responsibility on you to disclose why you. It's just a common thing that everybody does, so that I can go onto that sheet and go, oh yeah, that's what that person's communication preferences are. I will abide by that as best I possibly can without having to ask why. We could do that. We can make the world a better place for neurodivergent individuals without constantly having to grind those individuals down, saying, right, you need to put yourself on a pedestal so we can examine you and work out what ticks for you and what doesn't. Because a lot of autistic people hate being in the spotlight. Absolutely hate it. And actually, a lot of the trauma comes from, I'm going to mask. I'm not going to have my needs met because I don't want to have any kind of spotlight on me in the first place. But if we flip it around and have that autistic courtesy, which is not based on you disclosing, everybody's a winner. Absolutely everybody.
I love that. And I'm just looking at the time here, and so I want to ask Tim if you have any kind of final questions or comments with Dr. Luke before we wrap up.
No, I think we could go for another 2, 3, 4 hours quite easily. Luke, it's been absolutely a pleasure to sit and chat and brainstorm and break stuff down with you. And I just appreciate so much your perspective, the depth of your thinking, the nuanced nature of your thinking that's developed over the years, and your love for people, and wanting all people to be treated with that dignity and respect that they deserve. I just absolutely appreciate it. So thank you for being on our podcast. So I'll turn it back to Andy.
I was just wondering if there's any sort of like final word, anything you'd like to leave our listeners, a piece of advice or something you wish that they'd understand about autism.
A big question right at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes back. I'd reiterate what I said earlier about making sure that you don't have any preconceptions of prior knowledge about autism before getting to know the individual in front of you or next to you or behind you or sat on the floor with you or whatever it might be, that you're employing your lovely autistic courtesy that you're engaging with. So yeah, and stay positive. Like I wake up, I worked it out once, being an academic researcher, not a very good one, but I worked out it happens on average about once every 6 months. I wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to quit this field. It's just, nothing's changing. And then by lunchtime, I'll have got a grip. It's like, no, things are changing. Things are moving in the right direction. So have faith.
I really loved your honesty, your clarity, and also just this drive for empathy and kind of recognizing the uniqueness, the individuality of humans, of all humans, ultimately. And for everybody listening, I hope that sticks with you too. Maybe look where your own empathy blind spots are, but also, take that effort to see who am I? Who am I, and who am I as a unique individual? If you've spent a lifetime coping, just please know that you deserve safety, peace, and acceptance, and you don't need to earn it. And we'll see you next time on Time with Tim. Thank you for joining us on the Time with Tim podcast. If you'd like to share your own experiences or have questions, feel free to email us at podcasts@timfletcher.ca. Want to learn more about complex trauma? Subscribe to Tim Fletcher's YouTube channel for past lectures and his Friday night Tim Talks. You can also connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Looking for more support? We offer programs and courses to help with healing complex trauma and recovering from addictions. Visit timfletcher.ca to learn more or send us an inquiry. We're here to support you. Until we meet again, take care, and thank you for letting us be a part of your healing journey.